My stepmother, Alberto Torres, served 16 years, charged with seditious conspiracy, and was released in 1999 by President Clinton. My father was a longtime activist. My father was a Congregationalist pastor, minister. When we moved to Chicago, he was very much involved in the civil rights movement with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He marched with Dr. King in Birmingham and Selma. That when I was a young boy, I would see Betances and I would, Ostos in his bookshelf and ask him, who are those people? So he was a community activist from the 60s. So the culture in my home, as I was growing up in grammar school and then high school, was I lived in a home in which we acknowledge holidays that were Puerto Rican, and we acknowledge figures and próceres, historical figures. And I saw a set of parents that went to meetings and went to demonstrations, and we ourselves went to marches when I was in grammar school. So I was, my family culture was that, it was an activist family, but I mean very church orientated. The church played an important role for not only from a spiritual sense, but from a social sense. I considered my barrio, the members of the church, the Puerto Rican people who went to church. Yes, we have a barrio, a physical, geographical barrio, but my immediate barrio, in Puerto Rico, the old barrios were really like something that might be 10 houses. So my immediate barrio were those families that came to church. And when I grew up, and later on when I was in prison, and even today when I came out of prison, there were a few stops I needed to make, and one of them was even though my father, by the time I got out of prison, my father had died and had already retired as pastor of the church. He was pastor of that church for like, I'd say 40, I'd have to figure out, but it was 40-some years, and or maybe it was 30-some years. But I had to see those people. I wanted to, and they had an activity, but it was great because these are the people I grew up with. These are the people that were closest to me. My friends slash brothers, my blood brothers, in the old days we used to like cut ourselves and put our fingers together and say, we're brothers now. And those guys were the kids that went to church, went to my father's church, and so I needed to see them. And the ladies who were my surrogate mothers, or the old lady, the grandmother figure who knew all my dirty secrets, because she had busted me doing these things when I was a teenager or when I was a young kid, and would keep quiet, wouldn't put me out there. So these are the people that, and I wanted to see them. I was received by the community, yes. I did visit my biological mother, who's in a senior care home. She suffers from Alzheimer's or dementia, from her age. I wanted to see her. I hadn't seen her in 30 years, almost 30 years. I wanted to visit my father's grave and my niece's grave, but I also wanted to hang in the community and be met by all those students and people who supported us and did work for my release. But I wanted to visit the church and see those people and reminisce. I was aware of the civil rights movement because, if you lived in the United States and you weren't living in a cave or in a hole somewhere, you were aware of the civil rights movement. My father, there was a time when I was in 6th or 7th grade where my father said, I'm going to take you. He went on the trip to Birmingham. I think Birmingham happened. But it wasn't until high school that I was aware that my dad would ask me to always put the Puerto Rican flag out on certain days, and we had holidays that we would celebrate, the Three Kings, that are not holidays that were celebrated in my school, but that our church or our friends would celebrate. But so, I guess I guess there's awareness, and then there's what you do with that awareness, and and that's on the individual, So as I walked out of that class saying, I'm a Puerto Rican, that's where my roots are at, and thus I have a right to be an independent nation. what I did with that was on me, and that was basically information. My dad was an activist, but I got to say, my dad was kind of like a protective dad. He was a little bit of a mother hen, and I was always ready to go to like a young lord march, and oh no, you can't go there. There's going to be, police are going to be swinging clubs and that, and you're not going there. But he was always open to activities and like cultural activities and stuff. First of all, I'm in high school, so I mean I got some constraints, some familial constraints. I don't run my own life. I'm still a high school kid living at home. But yes, it was the times. It's very different. And I actually noticed that in prison among young kids. When I was in prison, I'd been in prison maybe 10, 12 years, and I started seeing young kids that were part of that campaign by the government to just jail so many people. Intense, because the actual sentencing laws changed, and they meant business. They meant to fill up the prisons. Just to show you how that's not just a little footnote. When I went in, there were 19,000 federal prisoners. When I left, there were 200,000. All right, and I seen that transition. Now they filled that up with young inner city kids. That's who went there. But I noticed in them just a different mentality than we had when I was that age, and I could sense it in them. I said, when we were that age, we just automatically assumed that you were supposed to be suspicious of the government, and you were supposed to be critical of the government. You were supposed to suspect and question. That way, if the government said, no, we didn't do that, you were supposed to be thinking, wait a minute now, they've been shown to lie a lot. But the students the young people that I guess they were students also, the young people that I was meeting didn't have that kind of awareness or sense of, they basically had the attitude, if the government says it, it must be true. And that really surprised me. I felt like, wow, this is a different kind of generation. And the difference is we were raised in that, in the 60s and 70s. It was well, at least for me growing up in the 60s, the attitude was, the government is trying to smash you. There's discrimination, and they're not doing nothing. And you had all these things that surrounded your awareness. That was your social reality. So. And that influenced you a lot. When I walk out of that classroom in Independentista, and I know that my uncle was a nationalist, and that his house was shot up, and that he served 7 years, and his sentence was commuted by Luis Muñoz Marin, because actually he had two life sentences after the insurrection, and he got out of it. Now that begins to make sense to me. He was the vice president of the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party in the town of Utuado. They had chapters in every, but he was a businessman. He owned a furniture store, Alberto Torres. And I gotta, just as a footnote, the building that he owned is still there today. When I went to Puerto Rico after 30 years in prison, now totally a developed political person, I had to make almost like a pilgrimage to that place. I wanted to see that building, because my father had told me that there was a wooden house on top where my uncle lived. And the bottom part was, I guess, the muebleria, the furniture store, and it holds that is the only house in the history of Puerto Rico that was ever strafed by a U.S. Army jet plane. During the insurrection, during the uprising, a plane came by and just, with their machine guns, fired from the airplane at the house. And it was my father's job. My uncle, of course, disappeared. He took off. And my father, who was already a pastor, a young pastor, it was his job to grab a bucket of concrete. He told me this story when I was in prison, to go plug up all the bullet holes, because it's a concrete structure. And he actually patched them up. And I told him, Viejo, I said, you should have left them there, as a visual legacy of what colonialism means. When people rise up to smash colonialism, to unshackle themselves to colonialism, this is what happens to your house. It gets full of bullet holes. It was the community of faith that began to offer the leadership in this movement for justice. And so, he was a pastor, and so they appealed to the religious community in Chicago, and so there was no contradiction. There was no religious contradiction, or between him supporting the civil rights movement and eventually supporting the anti-war movement as a Puerto Rican pastor. The same thing as for in his struggle for Puerto Rican independence. Now, it's not my father who was accused of being a member of the FALN. I was the one that was accused of being but you know what? People develop. I'm not where I was at 30 years ago. We all develop. Every day we get new information, we analyze, we grow as people. So we evolve, and my father was not immune to that growth as well. So that if you would have talked to my father would, whenever I would tell him, the young lords are having a big demonstration. He would say, you're not going to that. There's going to be, the police are going to go in there, they're going to arrest people. You're still in high school, you're not going. You can go to the peaceful march over here, But to all the way to the point where, but he would participate now. Don't get me wrong. Now he might go to that march, but he was protective. He was like all good fathers. Worried about his son, and I'm fighting the bit. I'm not even 17. Yeah, I'm 15 years old, whatever, and he knows where I'm at. He knows that I'm already identified myself as an independentista. So he has evolved, and his positions I know evolved.